Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to see you here. So, well, in 2 weeks, we're going to have a guest speaker, Dharmavidya Brazier, who spent several years writing a book on Dogen's work, the Genjo Koan. And it's the title of the book is The Dark Side of the Mirror. And it's a remarkable work. It's a novel interpretation of this many-faceted work of Ehe Dogen. So I thought we'd spend a little time talking about it before his talk and after his talk, because it's a work that bears close reading and is worth spending time with. So a little bit more background. Last time we talked about Dogen's life, and we kind of left off where he had met his true teacher, Rujing, in China, and been instructed to go back to Japan and spread the Dharma. So he did that. He returned to Japan at about 27 years of age, 12, 27, and returned to his former monastery, Kaninji, with all kinds of enthusiasm about what he had perceived, what he had become aware of in China. Unfortunately, his enthusiasm was not shared by those at the monastery who were in power. So at a certain point, he had to leave that monastery. And he wandered around a bit before finally starting a practice group in the distant suburbs of Kyoto. Now, when he first came back from China, he composed the Fukan Zazenji, which is a sort of the universal recommendation of Zazen. And he had this, I think at that time, evangelical vision that the practice of Zazen, having been proven so valuable for him, must be of value for everyone. And that would include monastics, lay people, anyone, any educational level, men, women, regardless of their differences. And that is reflected in the Fukan Zazenji, that spirit. And he maintained that spirit for several years after returning from China. And in 1233, when he was 33 years of age and setting up this practice facility in the outskirts, there was a lay practitioner who he was familiar with, who he wrote, it was kind of like a letter to him. And that is the text of the Genjo Koan. And this lay practitioner, I'm sure, was not just a beginner. And I'm sure the lay practitioner was very aware of Dogen's enthusiasm about Zazen. But Dogen was trying to go into it deeper in the Genjo Koan, and that's so he composed this about 4-page message to his lay follower. So I'd like to say that, talking about the Genjo Koan is a little daunting. For me anyway, because this is a work that has been, it's probably the most translated and most commentaried work of Dogen. And many, many illustrious scholars and Zen masters and people much more knowledgeable than myself have translated and or made comments about this work. But one thing you notice in reading some of these various translations and commentaries is that they're not all the same. They actually differ quite a bit. So there seems to be a range of opinion about what Dogen really meant. Even among those who have spent their lives honing their skills at translating medieval Japanese. So there are all these commentaries, and in some way, adding further comment to me feels a little like, throwing another corpse on the mass grave. I'm not sure I can accomplish anything. But on the other hand, this was composed for a lay person, and I do not think that Dogen was just trying to be obscure. I do not think that Dogen was just trying to be difficult. I think he was really trying to communicate as clearly as he could what he wanted to say. But it's something that's hard to say in words. So he resorted to various poetic devices and seeming paradoxes to try to communicate with his lay practitioner. And I don't think we need to be afraid of reading this and trying to derive meaning from it and developing our own thoughts about what it means. I think this is a work that that can easily stand up against many interpretations and commentaries. So we'll go forth and see where it leads. But with that going forth, I would caution against thinking that there is a one true interpretation of this work and that, oh, this is what it really means, and these other people are just wrong. Because I think it's multifaceted. And it has enough depth and strength to carry many meanings. And as you come back to it year after year, and most of these scholars who write about it and practitioners who write about it have been doing this, they've come back to it again and again and again and again, you might find that your opinion about the meaning changes over time as well. And I think that's really what this work is for. It's not just for a first read, but it's for really allowing it to soak in, to soak into the skin. So I thought we'd begin, though, with something that might seem pretty basic, and that is a passage from the Dhammapada, which most of you will recognize. It's the first passage from the Dhammapada, the sayings of Shakyamuni Buddha. We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. Speak or act with an impure mind, and trouble will follow you, as the wheel follows the ox that draws the cart. We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. Speak or act with an pure mind, and happiness will follow you as your shadow, unshakable. So that sounds pretty straightforward. We seem to have these two options. We can either have an impure mind or a pure mind and speak and act accordingly. And if we choose the impure mind, there's just trouble. And if we choose the pure mind, there's happiness. So what's the problem? just have a pure mind. And I think most people would prefer happiness over trouble. The Genjo Koan, I think, delves into perhaps some of the difficulties that we humans have with these notions of pure mind and impure mind, and how to navigate all this and how to actually put this into practice. Because try as we might to have a pure mind, sometimes we still get into trouble. And it's not real clear all the time what constitutes a pure mind and what constitutes an impure mind, and how to go about achieving either one. Most commentaries of the Genjo Koan start with a discussion of the title, but I'm going to defer that because I think that's probably when people write theses on the title, Genjo Koan, and what it means. I think it will become more clear as we go through the text what the title might mean. So I'm just going to jump right into the first section of the text. The text is divided into various sections. In the first section of the text, and I don't know if we'll get through all of this today, but the first section reads as this. This is one translation, by the way. There are many. This is by Tanahashi and Aitken, Robert Aitken and Kaz Tanahashi. And some people like this translation, other people don't. But it's the one I've sort of grown up with, so it's the one I'm most familiar with. So we'll start here. As all things are Buddha Dharma, there are delusion, realization, practice, birth and death, Buddhas, and sentient beings. As myriad things are without an abiding self, there is no delusion, no realization, no Buddha, no sentient being, no birth and death. The Buddha way, in essence, is leaping clear of abundance and lack. Thus, there are birth and death, delusion and realization, sentient beings and Buddhas. Yet, in attachment, blossoms fall, and in aversion, weeds spread. So before talking about this more, I'd like to just share what's called an interlinear translation of that first sentence to just give you an idea of what translators are dealing with. So the top line is a top line and a bottom line. The top line, of course, are Japanese characters, and the bottom line is English, as best as it can be translated literally from these characters. And of course, there are arguments about this literal translation too, but that's far beyond us. But just looking at this, many things, Buddha things, become time period, that is. Delusion realization is, practice, action is, life is, death is, many Buddhas are, mass life is, the life of the masses, ordinary people is. Well, faced with that, you can see that there would be different ways of working with it. And indeed, people have translated that in a wide variety of ways. And especially, I'm going to go back now, when you start combining it with the subsequent sentences, how these sentences relate depends heavily on how one interprets these strings of Japanese characters. So we have the first sentence, which talks about, this translator has said Buddha Dharma, but more literally, it's the character for things, Buddha things, the things the Buddha taught, which the Buddha used concepts to try and teach. And he was skilled in using these concepts, but they are concepts, delusion, realization, practice, birth and death, Buddhas and sentient beings. They're Buddha things, and all things are Buddha things. So the Buddha's teaching really took in everything, including these concepts. All things are Buddha things. But myriad things are without an abiding self. That's part of the Buddha's teachings. That's no self. So the idea of a separate thing called delusion, a separate thing called realization, a separate thing called Buddha, and a separate thing called sentient being, or birth or death, is not there. So There are no such separate things. I encountered an entertaining and an also insightful video by a religious text scholar specializing in medieval Japanese texts, Griffith Falk, who teaches at Sarah Lawrence College in California. And he used the example of, well, I mean, are these concepts? These are concepts. Are they empty? What do you? Well, he uses the example of democracy. What does democracy mean? We use the word all the time as if it has a very distinct meaning. But its meaning seems to depend a lot on context, how it's used. Rule of the people. Which people? How does the rule come into effect? When our country was founded, the rule of the people, democracy, was the rule of white male landowners. We all know this. And it's evolved over time. But I don't know that it's become necessarily more clear. Power of the people. Does that mean all people have equal power? Well, there's majority rules. What about the minority? Are they just without power? Democracy. And there are these conundrums in our own system. For instance, recently, there was a referendum in Missouri, as most of you know, that about whether there should be Medicaid expansion. And the voters, the majority of the voters said, yes, there should be. That sounds like as pure a democracy as you can imagine. And yet, the representatives in Jefferson City who were charged with enacting this chose not to. Because, as one representative said, well, they don't really know what they're asking for. They're not really wise enough to make these decisions. So democracy. So it's a concept that's flexible, and all these things are. This delusion, what's a delusion? One person's delusion is another person's, firm belief. Realization. How do we know we're realized? How do we know we're awake, enlightened? So as myriad things are without abiding self, there is no delusion, no realization, no Buddha, no sentient being, no birth and death. Where does that leave us? And then we go on to the third sentence, the Buddha way. This is different from Buddha Dharma. This is the Buddha way. The Buddha way, in essence, is leaping clear of abundance and lack. Thus, there are birth and death, delusion and realization, sentient beings and Buddhas. So one could say the Buddha way involves a synthesis of the first two ways of seeing things. The first way of seeing things is to divide things up into many things and consider them separate and perhaps opposing. Birth opposed to death, Buddhas opposed to sentient beings, The second way of looking at things is to say, well, there are no things. It's all just one remarkable universe filled with Buddha. And the third way is to bring these two together in such a manner that birth is not opposed to death. It's more or less complementary, birth, death. Delusion not opposed to realization, more or less complementary, delusion realization. Sentient beings not opposed to Buddhas, complementary, sentient beings, Buddhas. And actually, in the literal translation from the characters, they do drop the conjugations there and just have these pairings in the third sentence. Delusion realization, sentient beings, Buddhas. The Buddha way. We might consider this the middle path. So I was taking a walk. I'm going to wind up here and not get into the last sentence. We'll take that next time. But I was taking a walk this morning and in my neighborhood, and I turned off one of the main streets into a side street, sort of quiet residential street. And there was a large dog, well, it was actually a medium-sized dog, in the front yard of one of the houses. Not unusual. Barking at me, not unusual. This dog was one of these, it looks like sort of a pit bull mix. They're common up here. Short hair, sort of a broad forehead, short snout, big teeth. And this particular dog had a crooked tail, suggesting that it had been in a fight or two. And most dogs, I found, if you just keep walking calmly, they back off and they lose interest after you've walked a while. Well, this dog, as I walked along calmly, every time I would take a step, the dog would take a step for me, toward me, or one or two steps, and bark louder. Well, in some sense, okay, there's me, there's dog. In another sense, there's no me, there's no dog. So what do I do? What do I do? And I think a lot of the Genjo Koan is about, so what do you do? Well, I could say, well, I have a right to walk down this sidewalk, and I have a walking stick, and if the dog comes for me, I'll just hope that I can beat it away with my walking stick. Or I could turn around and take another street, which is what I chose to do. So yeah, the dog and I are kindred spirits, but I don't know that the dog was perceiving it that way. So in one sense, there's me and dog. In another sense, no me, no dog. And finally, there's just dog me and deciding what to do. So that's sort of the enticing beginning of this work, the Genjo Koan. these first three sentences, a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis in the middle way. So I think I'll stop there, and the next sentence seems like it just comes out of nowhere, but I don't think it does, and we'll discuss that more next time. So I think we'll break up into groups then. And let me just stop the share here. We'll break up into groups, well, a couple groups anyway, and discuss this for a few minutes. I'm interested in what your take on it is. What was Dogen trying to say? Does it make any sense? How does it fit with what else you know about Buddhist teachings? So we'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening.